The crystal chandelier cast diamonds of light across the marble floor of the Al-Rashid mansion's grand ballroom, as Sheikh Omar bin Khalid adjusted his traditional white thobe and checked his Patek Philippe watch. It was 11:47 p.m. on a humid Thursday evening in Dubai, and the last of his business associates had finally departed from what had been another successful networking dinner. Oil futures, real estate ventures, and technology investments had dominated the conversation, as they always did. The numbers were staggering, the profits astronomical, yet Omar felt the familiar emptiness settling over him, like the desert sand that perpetually threatened to reclaim even the most magnificent structures. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 34, Omar had inherited not just his father's petroleum empire, but also the weight of expectations that came with being the third generation of Al-Rashid wealth. His great-grandfather had struck oil in the 1940s, his grandfather had modernized the business, and his father had expanded into international markets. Now it fell to Omar to maintain the dynasty while navigating an increasingly complex global economy. The mansion around him, with its imported Italian marble, Persian rugs worth more than most people's homes, an art collection that included works by masters whose names appeared in auction house catalogs, stood as a testament to that success. Yet tonight, like so many nights before, it felt more like a mausoleum than a home. The domestic staff had long since retreated to their quarters, following the precise schedule that governed every aspect of the household's operation. Omar preferred it this way, working late into the night when the phone stopped ringing and the parade of advisors, contractors, and fortune seekers finally ceased their relentless demands for his attention. He made his way toward his private study, where reports from his various enterprises awaited his review, when he heard something that made him pause. Someone was singing. The voice was soft, melodic, drifting from somewhere deeper in the mansion's east wing where the service areas were located. It wasn't Arabic, nor was it English or French, the languages most commonly heard in his multilingual household. The melody was haunting, almost prayer-like, and it carried a quality that made Omar's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't immediately identify. Curiosity overrode his usual respect for staff privacy, and he found himself following the sound through corridors he rarely traversed. The singing grew clearer as he approached the main kitchen, where a warm yellow light spilled from the doorway. Omar hesitated, knowing he was venturing into territory that was technically his but practically belonged to the people who kept his life running smoothly. Through the partially open door, he could see a young woman at the large prep sink, washing what appeared to be the last of the evening's dishes. Her back was turned to him, and she wore the standard gray uniform of the household staff, her dark hair pulled back in a simple braid. The song she sang was definitely not in any language he recognized, yet something about it stirred a memory he couldn't quite grasp. The woman reached for a dish towel and turned slightly, giving Omar a profile view of her face. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, with olive-toned skin and features that suggested Mediterranean or perhaps Eastern European heritage. What struck him most, however, was the complete absorption with which she performed her task. There was no sense of drudgery or resentment in her movements, only a kind of meditative focus that transformed the mundane act of washing dishes into something almost ritualistic. Omar was about to retreat, feeling increasingly uncomfortable about his inadvertent spying, when the woman's song shifted. The melody remained the same, but now the words were different. They were Hebrew words that he understood. The recognition hit Omar like a physical blow. The woman was singing the Shema, one of the most fundamental prayers in Judaism, but she was singing it with variations he had learned as a child, sitting beside his grandmother in the small synagogue in the Jewish quarter of Old Baghdad. His grandmother, Sarah Al-Rashid, had been one of the last Jews to leave Iraq in the 1970s, carrying with her not just her possessions but also the traditions and languages of a community that had existed for over 2 millennia. She had married Omar's grandfather in what was considered a scandalous union at the time, a Jewish woman and a Muslim man, but their love had transcended religious boundaries and family objections. Sarah had died when Omar was 12, but not before she had taught him Hebrew, shared stories of her childhood, and given him an understanding of Jewish traditions that he had largely kept private in his adult life. In a region where religious and cultural tensions often ran high, Omar had found it easier to let that part of his heritage fade into the background. His business associates knew him as a progressive Muslim businessman, modernized and Western-educated, but they had no idea that he could read Hebrew texts or that some of his most cherished childhood memories involved lighting Shabbat candles with his grandmother. Now, standing in the doorway of his own kitchen, listening to a staff member sing prayers that connected him to that hidden part of himself, Omar felt a rush of emotions he had spent years suppressing. The woman's pronunciation was perfect, her understanding of the prayer's rhythm and cadence suggesting this was not something she had learned casually. This was the Hebrew of someone who had grown up with the language, who understood its spiritual significance. Omar must have made some sound, perhaps a sharp intake of breath, because the woman suddenly stopped singing and turned toward the doorway. When she saw him standing there, her face went through a rapid series of expressions: surprise, embarrassment, and what might have been fear. She immediately began to bow, as protocol demanded when encountering a member of the Al-Rashid family. "I apologize, Sheikh Omar," she said in accented English, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did not know you were still awake. I will finish quickly and leave you in peace." "Please," Omar said, stepping into the kitchen proper. "Don't stop on my account. That was beautiful. What song were you singing?" The woman, who couldn't have been much older than 25, kept her eyes downcast as she answered. "It is nothing important, sir. Just something from my childhood. I should not have been singing while working. It was unprofessional." "On the contrary," Omar replied, moving closer but maintaining a respectful distance. "Music makes any task more pleasant. I was curious about the language. It sounded like Hebrew." The effect of his words was immediate and dramatic. The woman's head snapped up, her dark eyes meeting his for the first time. There was wariness there, and something else that might have been calculation. In many parts of the Middle East, admitting to Jewish heritage or knowledge could have serious consequences, and Omar realized that his casual mention of Hebrew might have placed her in an uncomfortable position. "You know Hebrew, Sheikh Omar?" she asked carefully, her accent becoming more pronounced with her nervousness. "Some," Omar admitted. "My grandmother taught me when I was young. She was Iraqi Jewish, from Baghdad originally." The admission hung in the air between them, creating a moment of mutual vulnerability. Omar had just shared something he rarely discussed with anyone, while the woman was clearly trying to decide how much of her own truth she could safely reveal. "I am Miriam," she said finally. "Miriam Goldstein. I have been working here for 6 months." "Goldstein," Omar repeated, noting the obviously Jewish surname. "You're Israeli?" "Originally, yes," Miriam replied, then quickly added, "but I have all proper work permits and documentation." Mr. Hassan in personnel verified everything when I was hired. Omar waved away her concern about paperwork. "I'm not questioning your right to be here, Miriam. I'm just surprised that Hassan hired someone with your background without mentioning it to me. Not because it's a problem," he added quickly, seeing her expression, "but because it's unusual." The truth was that it was more than unusual. It was almost unprecedented. The Al-Rashid household employed staff from many countries, but Omar couldn't recall ever having an Israeli employee. The political complexities alone would normally have made such a hire impossible, regardless of the individual's qualifications. "Mr. Hassan does not know," Miriam said quietly. "My passport is Romanian. I was born in Israel, but my family moved to Romania when I was young. Officially, I am Romanian Jewish, not Israeli." The distinction was important, Omar realized. Romanian citizenship would have made her hiring much more straightforward, while Israeli citizenship might have raised flags throughout the hiring process. But the fact that she was being less than completely honest about her background created its own set of complications. Why the deception? Omar asked, though he thought he already knew the answer. "Because I needed this job," Miriam replied with simple honesty. "My grandmother is ill in Bucharest. The medical costs are very expensive, and jobs in Romania that pay enough to help her are scarce. When I heard about positions here in Dubai, I applied. The agency that helped me suggested that emphasizing my Romanian citizenship rather than my Israeli birth would make the process easier." Omar nodded, understanding the pragmatic logic behind her choice. Dubai was one of the more liberal and cosmopolitan cities in the region, but even here, certain political realities created barriers that had nothing to do with individual merit or character. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "What kind of work did you do before coming here?" he asked. "I was a teacher," Miriam said, a note of pride entering her voice. "Hebrew and Jewish studies at a school in Bucharest. But the pay was very low, and when my grandmother became sick, I knew I needed to find something that would allow me to send money home." The revelation that she was an educated professional working as domestic help added another layer to Omar's growing interest in her story. It also explained the quality of her Hebrew and her obvious intelligence. "That must have been a difficult decision," Omar observed, "leaving your career to take care of family." "Family is everything," Miriam replied simply. "My grandmother raised me after my parents died. She gave up much to ensure I had an education and opportunities. Now, it is my turn to sacrifice for her." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside the kitchen. Omar recognized the measured pace of Marcus Anderson, his head of household security, conducting his nightly rounds. The presence of the mansion's owner in the kitchen at midnight, engaged in conversation with a staff member, would certainly raise questions that Omar wasn't prepared to answer. "Finish what you need to do here," he told Miriam quietly. "But perhaps we could continue this conversation another time. I find myself curious about your grandmother's condition and whether there might be ways to help." "That is very kind, Sheikh Omar, but I do not expect charity," Miriam replied with quiet dignity. "I work hard for my wages and I prefer to earn what I receive." "I respect that," Omar said, impressed by her response. "But sometimes there are opportunities that benefit everyone involved. We can discuss it another time." He left the kitchen before Marcus arrived, but the encounter with Miriam had shattered his earlier mood of restless dissatisfaction. Back in his study, surrounded by financial reports and business projections, Omar found his mind returning again and again to the young woman who had been singing Hebrew prayers while washing dishes in his kitchen. There was something about her that had resonated with him on a level he hadn't experienced in years. Over the following days, Omar found himself paying more attention to the household staff's routines, though he was careful not to make his interest obvious. He learned that Miriam worked the evening shift from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m., handling cleaning duties in the main house while the family and guests were either dining or had retired for the night. She was efficient and thorough according to the reports he discreetly requested from Mrs. Chen, the household manager, and had received no complaints from other staff members. What Omar discovered through his own observation was more interesting than any formal report could have provided. Miriam approached her work with the same focused attention he had witnessed that first night in the kitchen. Whether she was dusting furniture in the library or polishing fixtures in the guest bathrooms, she brought a level of care and precision to her tasks that suggested she took pride in doing them well, regardless of their humble nature. More significantly, Omar began to notice small improvements in the areas where Miriam worked. Books in the library were arranged more logically, with Hebrew and Jewish texts that had been scattered throughout various shelves now grouped together in a way that made them easier to find. Fresh flowers appeared in vases that had previously been merely decorative. The prayer room that Omar's grandmother had insisted on including in the mansion's design, but which had been largely neglected since her death, was now spotless and arranged with obvious reverence for its original purpose. These changes might have gone unnoticed by most people, but they spoke to Omar of someone who understood the significance of the objects and spaces she was caring for. It was as if Miriam had recognized the Jewish elements of his heritage reflected in his home and had taken it upon herself to honor them properly. 10 days after their first encounter, Omar made a decision that surprised even him. Instead of working late in his study, he made his way to the kitchen at the time he knew Miriam would be finishing her shift. She was there, as he had expected, but tonight she wasn't singing. Instead, she was reading a book while eating what appeared to be a simple dinner of bread, cheese, and fruit. The book was in Hebrew. "Working late again?" Omar asked from the doorway, making sure to announce his presence this time rather than startling her. Miriam looked up, quickly closing the book and standing. "Sheikh Omar." "Yes, sir. I was just finishing my meal before heading home." "Please, sit," Omar said, entering the kitchen and gesturing for her to return to her chair. "I don't want to interrupt your dinner. What are you reading?" Miriam hesitated, clearly unsure whether to answer honestly. "Poetry," she said finally. "Hebrew poetry. It helps me remember home." "May I?" Omar asked, indicating the book. After a moment's consideration, Miriam handed it to him. It was a collection of works by Yehuda Amichai, one of Israel's most celebrated poets. Omar opened it randomly and read a few lines aloud in Hebrew, his pronunciation rusty but serviceable. "Your grandmother taught you well," Miriam observed, genuine surprise in her voice. "She was a remarkable woman," Omar replied, closing the book and handing it back. She believed that language was a bridge between cultures, not a barrier. She spoke Arabic, Hebrew, Kurdish, and some English. She used to say that every language you spoke made you a slightly different person. "She sounds wise," Miriam said. "My grandmother says something similar. She speaks Romanian, Hebrew, Yiddish, and Russian." During the war, those languages saved her life at different times. "The war?" "World War II. She survived the Holocaust, but lost most of her family. When she met my grandfather after the war, they decided to start fresh in Romania. Then, when I was 8, we moved to Israel for a few years before returning to Romania when my grandfather became ill." The bare facts of Miriam's family history, delivered in her matter-of-fact tone, painted a picture of displacement and survival that Omar found both heartbreaking and inspiring. Here was someone whose family had been shaped by some of the 20th century's greatest tragedies, yet who had maintained her cultural identity and found ways to honor her heritage even while working in a foreign country under an assumed nationality. "That explains your Hebrew," Omar said, "and your reverence for tradition. I've noticed the changes you've made in the prayer room." Miriam's cheeks colored slightly. "I hope I didn't overstep. It just seemed wrong to leave it neglected when it was obviously built with such care." "You didn't overstep," Omar assured her. "My grandmother would have appreciated what you've done. She always said that sacred spaces needed to be tended, not just preserved." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the kitchen's warm lighting creating an atmosphere of intimacy that felt both natural and slightly forbidden. Omar was acutely aware that this conversation, like their first encounter, was crossing boundaries that his position in the household's hierarchy normally made absolute. "Miriam," he said finally, "I've been thinking about what you said regarding your grandmother's medical expenses. I may have a proposition that could help both of us." Miriam's expression became guarded. "What kind of proposition?" "I've been considering hiring a cultural consultant," Omar said, the idea forming even as he spoke. "Someone who could help me better understand and preserve the Jewish elements of my family's heritage. My grandmother left behind books, documents, and religious items that I've never properly cataloged or cared for. I think she would have wanted them to be maintained by someone who understood their significance." "You want me to be your cultural consultant?" Miriam asked, disbelief evident in her voice. "Part-time," Omar clarified, "in addition to your current duties if you're willing. It would mean additional compensation, of course, enough to make a significant difference in your grandmother's care." Miriam was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing the offer and its implications. "Why would you do this?" she asked finally. "You barely know me." It was a fair question, and one Omar had been asking himself. "Because I think my grandmother would have liked you," he said honestly. "Because I believe that preserving cultural heritage is important, regardless of political boundaries. And because I sense that you understand the weight of carrying forward traditions that connect us to our ancestors. And if people ask questions about why you've hired an Israeli Jew as a cultural consultant," Omar had considered this concern as well, "then I'll tell them the truth, that preserving my family's complete heritage is more important to me than political considerations. My grandfather loved my grandmother, despite their different backgrounds. I think I can handle whatever criticism might come from following their example." Miriam studied his face intently, as if trying to determine whether his words were genuine or simply the kind of liberal sentiments that wealthy people sometimes expressed without truly meaning. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded slowly. "I would be honored to help preserve your grandmother's legacy," she said. "But I have conditions." "Name them." "First, this arrangement must be completely professional. I will not accept charity disguised as employment, and I will not allow my personal circumstances to compromise my integrity or yours." "Agreed." "Second, if at any point this creates problems for you or your family, you must end it immediately. I will not be responsible for damaging your reputation or business relationships." "I understand, though I don't think that will be necessary." "Third," Miriam continued, "I want to be honest with you about my background. Not just Romanian citizenship, but everything. If we're going to work together on something as personal as family heritage, there should be no deceptions between us." Omar felt a flutter of apprehension at this last condition. Miriam's partial honesty had already created complications. Complete honesty might create even more. But the same instinct that had led him to approach her in the first place told him that genuine trust was worth the risk. "Tell me everything," he said. Miriam took a deep breath. "My full name is Miriam Sarah Goldstein. I was born in Tel Aviv in 1998, but my family moved to Bucharest when I was 10. My father was a historian, my mother was a linguist. They died in a car accident when I was 16, and I was raised by my maternal grandmother Elena. I graduated from the University of Bucharest with degrees in Hebrew studies and education. I taught for 3 years before coming here." She paused, clearly debating whether to continue. "There's more. Before I left Israel, I served 2 years in the Israel Defense Forces, as all citizens must. I was in an intelligence unit that focused on cultural and linguistic analysis. Nothing classified or sensitive, but enough to make my background potentially complicated in certain political contexts." Omar absorbed this information without immediate comment. Miriam's military service did add another layer of complexity to the situation, though her description of her role suggested it was more academic than operational. More importantly, her willingness to reveal this potentially damaging information demonstrated a level of trust and integrity that impressed him. "Thank you for telling me," he said finally. "I appreciate your honesty, and it doesn't change my offer. If anything, your analytical and educational background makes you even more qualified for what I have in mind." "You're not concerned about the political implications?" "I'm more concerned about doing right by my grandmother's memory," Omar replied. "Politics fade, but family legacy endures." They shook hands across the kitchen table, sealing an agreement that both knew would change their relationship in ways they couldn't yet predict. As Omar walked back to his study, he felt the same sense of anticipation and uncertainty that had preceded every major decision in his business career. But this felt different, more personal, carrying with it the possibility of discoveries that went beyond financial gain or professional achievement. 3 days later, Omar led Miriam to a room on the mansion's 3rd floor that had been locked since his grandmother's death 15 years earlier. The key turned stiffly in the ornate lock, and the door opened to reveal a space that seemed frozen in time. Sunlight filtered through gauze curtains, illuminating bookcases that lined 3 walls from floor to ceiling. A large desk sat in the center of the room, its surface covered with papers held down by a crystal paperweight. Religious artifacts occupied places of honor on various shelves: silver candlesticks, a ornate Havdalah set, several ancient-looking books bound in worn leather. "She called this her sanctuary," Omar said quietly. "After she died, I couldn't bring myself to disturb anything. It felt too much like violating something sacred." Miriam moved slowly around the room, her eyes taking in details with obvious reverence. She paused before a particular bookshelf, reaching out to touch the spine of a volume without actually removing it. "These are Talmudic commentaries," she said softly. "Some of them are very old. And this," she indicated another section, "is a complete set of Hebrew literary classics. Your grandmother was clearly a woman of considerable learning." "She was," Omar agreed. "She used to bring me here when I was young and read to me from some of these books. I understood maybe half of what she was saying, but I loved the sound of her voice and the sense that I was being let into something important and secret." Miriam opened one of the prayer books and examined the pages carefully. "This has handwritten notes in the margins. Your grandmother's commentary on the prayers. These annotations would be fascinating to study." "That's exactly the kind of thing I was hoping you could help me understand," Omar said. "I want to preserve not just the objects, but the knowledge and traditions they represent. My grandmother's insights, her interpretations, the stories behind each item." Over the following weeks, Miriam threw herself into the project with an enthusiasm that reminded Omar why he had been drawn to her in the first place. She approached each book, each artifact, each handwritten note with the careful attention of a scholar and the loving reverence of someone who understood their deeper significance. She created detailed inventories, photographed important pages, and began the delicate process of translating his grandmother's Hebrew notes into English. More importantly, she began to help Omar understand the fuller context of his heritage. Through his grandmother's books and papers, they pieced together a picture of a vibrant Jewish community in Baghdad that had existed for centuries before political pressures forced its dissolution. Sarah's family had been merchants and scholars, contributing to both Jewish learning and the broader cultural life of Iraq until circumstances made their position untenable. "Your grandmother was remarkable," Miriam told Omar one evening as they worked together in the sanctuary. "Her notes show not just religious knowledge, but deep philosophical thinking about how to maintain faith and identity in the face of displacement and loss. She was writing about questions that Jewish communities around the world have grappled with for generations, such as how to honor the past while adapting to new circumstances, how to preserve traditions without becoming trapped by them, how to maintain cultural identity when living as a minority." Her insights could be valuable to scholars studying Jewish diaspora communities. The suggestion that his grandmother's private thoughts might have broader academic value had never occurred to Omar, but as Miriam explained more about the historical context and significance of Sarah's writings, he began to understand that they had uncovered something genuinely important. "Would you be interested in helping me prepare some of this material for publication?" he asked. "Not immediately, but eventually. I think my grandmother would have liked the idea of her thoughts contributing to scholarship." "I would be honored," Miriam replied, her eyes bright with excitement. "But such a project would require careful research and collaboration with other scholars. It could take years." "I'm not going anywhere," Omar said, then realized how his words might be interpreted. "I mean, this isn't a short-term project. I'm committed to seeing it through properly, regardless of how long it takes." As their work together deepened, so did their conversations. Omar found himself sharing details about his business challenges, his complicated relationship with family expectations, and his growing sense that his wealth and position came with responsibilities he hadn't fully understood or accepted. Miriam, in turn, spoke about her life in Israel and Romania, her grandmother's stories about pre-war Jewish life, and her own struggles to find meaning and purpose in a world that often seemed to demand that she choose between different aspects of her identity. "Do you ever feel torn between being Jewish and being Romanian?" Omar asked one evening. "Or between being Israeli and working in an Arab country?" "Every day," Miriam admitted. "But I've learned that identity doesn't have to be singular or simple. I can be Jewish and Romanian and Israeli and a teacher and a granddaughter and someone who works in Dubai. The complications aren't flaws, they're just part of who I am." "My grandmother used to say something similar," Omar remembered. "She said that being both Jewish and Iraqi, and later Jewish and the wife of a Muslim, had made her more herself, not less." "She sounds like she understood something that many people never learn," Miriam observed. "That difference isn't threat, it's richness." Their evening conversations became the highlight of Omar's days. While his business dealings continued to demand his attention during daylight hours, he found himself looking forward to the quiet hours in his grandmother's sanctuary, working alongside someone who shared his growing fascination with the layers of history and meaning they were uncovering. It was during one of these sessions, nearly 2 months after their collaboration had begun, that Omar realized their relationship had evolved into something more complex than a simple employment arrangement. They had developed an easy rapport, finishing each other's thoughts when discussing their discoveries, sharing private jokes about particularly challenging translations, consulting each other about questions that extended far beyond the project at hand. More significantly, Omar had begun to notice things about Miriam that had nothing to do with her scholarly abilities or cultural knowledge. The way she unconsciously tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when concentrating on a difficult passage. The grace with which she handled fragile books and artifacts. The expression of quiet joy that crossed her face when she successfully deciphered a particularly obscure annotation. He was falling in love with her, and the realization both thrilled and terrified him. The complications were obvious and numerous. She was his employee, making any romantic feelings inherently problematic from a professional standpoint. She was Israeli, he was an Arab businessman with extensive ties throughout the Middle East. She was Jewish, he was Muslim, and while his grandmother had successfully navigated such a religious divide, that had been a different time and place. Most significantly, she had given no indication that she shared his growing feelings, and any attempt to change their relationship could destroy the trust and friendship they had built. Yet despite all these rational objections, Omar found himself drawn to her with an intensity that reminded him of his grandmother's stories about meeting his grandfather. Sarah had described falling in love as a recognition, a sudden understanding that another person completed something in yourself that you hadn't realized was incomplete. That was exactly how Omar felt when he watched Miriam work, listened to her insights, or simply enjoyed her company during their quiet evening conversations. The question was what, if anything, he should do about it. The decision came for Omar 3 weeks later, not through careful deliberation, but through a moment of crisis that stripped away all pretense and revealed the true depth of his feelings. It was a Tuesday morning when Mrs. Chen knocked on his office door with an expression of barely controlled panic. "Sheikh Omar, I need to speak with you immediately about Miriam," she said, closing the door behind her with unusual firmness. Omar's pulse quickened. "What's happened? Is she hurt?" "No, sir, but there's been a serious development. I received a call this morning from Immigration Services. They're conducting a routine audit of all household staff documentation, and they specifically mentioned wanting to review Miriam's papers. They'll be here Thursday morning." The blood drained from Omar's face. An immigration audit meant thorough background checks, verification of all documentation, and quite possibly the discovery of Miriam's Israeli origins. Even if her Romanian passport was legitimate, any deeper investigation would reveal discrepancies in her story that could result in immediate deportation and potential criminal charges for document fraud. "How much time do we have?" Omar asked, his mind already racing through possible solutions. 48 hours, Mrs. Chen replied. "I've been trying to reach Miriam, but she's not answering her phone. Her shift doesn't start until this evening." Omar glanced at his watch. It was barely 9 a.m., and Miriam typically slept until early afternoon after finishing her overnight duties. But this couldn't wait for her normal schedule. "I'll handle this," Omar said, grabbing his car keys. "Cancel my meetings for today. If anyone asks, tell them I have a family emergency." Mrs. Chen nodded, though her expression suggested she understood that this crisis extended far beyond normal employer relationships. Omar's obvious distress over a staff member's potential deportation was revealing in ways he couldn't afford to examine at the moment. 20 minutes later, Omar stood outside Miriam's apartment building in the Karama district, a modest neighborhood where many of Dubai's foreign workers lived. He had never visited her home before, and the contrast between her living situation and his mansion struck him forcefully. The building was clean but clearly budget-oriented, with small balconies draped with laundry and window-mounted air conditioning units working overtime against the desert heat. He found her apartment number and knocked, hoping he wasn't waking her from desperately needed sleep. When Miriam opened the door, she was clearly surprised to see him, her hair loosely braided and wearing casual clothes that made her look younger and somehow more vulnerable than she appeared in her work uniform. "Omar, what are you doing here? Is everything all right?" "We need to talk," he said. "There's been a development that affects your situation here." Miriam's expression immediately became serious. She stepped aside to let him enter, and Omar found himself in a small but meticulously organized studio apartment. Books in multiple languages lined makeshift shelves, and a small table near the window served as both desk and dining area. A laptop computer sat open, displaying what appeared to be an email composition window with text in Hebrew. "Immigration Services is conducting an audit of household staff," Omar said without preamble. "They specifically mentioned wanting to review your documentation. They'll be at the house Thursday morning." Miriam sank into the apartment's single chair, her face pale. "They know," she said quietly. "Someone must have reported something." "We don't know that," Omar said, though privately he suspected she might be right. "But even if this is just routine, Any thorough investigation of your background could reveal inconsistencies. I'll resign immediately, Miriam said, standing up with sudden determination. If I'm no longer employed by your household, they have no reason to investigate further. I can disappear before Thursday morning. Absolutely not, Omar said firmly. Running will only make you look guilty and ensure that you can never work legally in the UAE again. We need a better solution. What solution? Miriam asked, desperation creeping into her voice. You've seen my documents. They're legitimate but incomplete. Any serious investigation will reveal that I haven't been completely honest about my background. Omar had been thinking about this exact scenario since Mrs. Chen's revelation, and he had reached a conclusion that both excited and terrified him. It was risky, potentially scandalous, and would change both their lives irrevocably. But it was also the only solution that guaranteed Miriam's safety while allowing them to continue their work together. "Marry me," he said. The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Miriam stared at him in complete shock, clearly certain she had misheard. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "Marry me," Omar repeated, his voice steadier now that the proposal was out in the open. "Marriage to a UAE citizen would give you immediate legal protection and make any questions about your previous documentation irrelevant. Immigration Services doesn't investigate the wives of established citizens." "Omar, that's insane," Miriam said, though her tone suggested she was considering the practical aspects even as she protested. "You can't marry someone just to solve their immigration problems. The scandal alone would destroy your reputation." "My reputation will survive," Omar said with more confidence than he felt. "Mixed marriages aren't uncommon in Dubai, and my family has a history of them. As for my motives," he paused, knowing that this moment would determine the future of their relationship, "they're not purely altruistic." Miriam looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean that over the past 2 months working with you, getting to know you, I've come to care about you in ways that go beyond professional collaboration or cultural preservation." Omar took a deep breath, committing fully to honesty. "I'm in love with you, Miriam. I have been for weeks. Possibly since that first night I heard you singing in my kitchen." The admission created a silence that stretched between them like a bridge neither was certain they should cross. Miriam's expression cycled through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been hope before settling into wariness. "You're proposing marriage based on feelings you've developed over 2 months?" she asked. "Omar, that's not how real life works. People don't make life-altering decisions based on workplace attractions." "My grandmother married my grandfather after knowing him for 6 weeks," Omar replied. "She used to say that when you recognize something real, time becomes irrelevant. Duration doesn't create love, it only reveals whether love was genuine to begin with." "This isn't the same situation," Miriam protested. "Your grandparents weren't facing deportation and scandal. They had the luxury of making choices based purely on emotion." "Did they?" Omar asked. "A Jewish woman and a Muslim man in 1960s Iraq? They faced challenges that make our situation look simple by comparison. The difference is that they chose love over fear." Miriam moved to the window, looking out at the busy street below where vendors were setting up their stalls for the day's commerce. Omar could see her mind working, weighing options and consequences with the same analytical precision she brought to their research. "Even if your feelings are genuine," she said without turning around, "you don't know mine. You're asking me to make a decision that affects both our futures based on your emotions alone." "Then tell me," Omar said quietly. "Tell me what you feel." Miriam was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I feel terrified," she said finally. "Terrified of being deported. Terrified of losing my grandmother's medical care. Terrified of accepting help I haven't earned. But also terrified of how much I've come to depend on our evening conversations, how much I look forward to seeing you each day, how natural it feels to work beside you on something that matters to both of us." She turned from the window to face him. "I've been trying to convince myself that what I feel is just gratitude, or professional admiration, or the natural result of spending time with someone who understands parts of my heritage that I rarely get to share. But if I'm being honest, it's more than that. Much more. Then what's holding you back?" The same thing that should be holding you back, Miriam replied. The recognition that marriage based on crisis decisions and overwhelming circumstances rarely leads to lasting happiness. We've known each other for 2 months, Omar. 2 months of evening conversations and scholarly collaboration. That's not enough foundation for a lifetime commitment. Omar moved closer to her, stopping just within arm's reach. You're right, he admitted. In normal circumstances, this would be impossibly premature, but circumstances aren't normal, and we don't have the luxury of a conventional courtship. The question isn't whether we know each other well enough for marriage. The question is whether we care enough about each other to take the risk of discovering who we might become together. And if we discover we're completely incompatible, if the attraction fades once the crisis is resolved and we're just two people who made an impulsive decision under pressure, then we'll deal with that when it happens, Omar said. But right now, the alternative is losing any chance to find out. If you're deported, we'll never know what might have been possible. Miriam studied his face intently, and Omar had the sense that she was looking for something specific, some sign that would help her make this impossible decision. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her, because her expression softened slightly. There would have to be conditions, she said finally. If we do this, it has to be real. Not a paper marriage or a temporary arrangement, but a genuine attempt to build something lasting. I won't be anyone's convenient solution or charitable project. Agreed, Omar said immediately. What other conditions? Complete honesty about everything. No more secrets about backgrounds, expectations, or concerns. If we're going to try to make this work, we need to know exactly who we're marrying. Of course. And we need to be realistic about the challenges, Miriam continued. Your family, your business associates, the cultural and religious differences. If those things become insurmountable problems, we address them directly rather than pretending they don't exist. Omar nodded, though privately he was already dreading the conversations he would need to have with his family and colleagues. His mother, in particular, would be horrified by the speed of the decision and the unconventional circumstances surrounding it. There's one more thing, Miriam said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. If we do this, I need to know that you see me as an equal partner, not someone you're rescuing. I've spent my whole life being underestimated because of my gender, my nationality, or my circumstances. I won't enter a marriage where I'm viewed as the grateful recipient of male generosity. Miriam, Omar said, reaching for her hands, you're the strongest, most capable person I've ever met. The idea that you need rescuing is absurd. If anything, you've rescued me from a life that was successful but empty. Then ask me properly, Miriam said, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Not as a solution to a crisis, but as a choice about our future. Omar dropped to one knee in the small apartment, holding both her hands in his. Miriam Sarah Goldstein, he said, using her full name deliberately. Will you marry me? Not because Immigration Services is investigating, not because you need legal protection, but because I love you and want to spend my life learning everything there is to know about you. Yes, Miriam said, tears streaming down her face. Yes, I'll marry you. The wedding took place 36 hours later in a civil ceremony at the Dubai courts, with Mrs. Chen and Marcus Anderson serving as witnesses. Miriam wore a simple blue dress she had purchased that morning, while Omar had chosen a traditional white thobe that had belonged to his grandfather. The ceremony itself was brief and formal, conducted in Arabic and English by a judge who had known Omar's family for years and asked no uncomfortable questions about the sudden nature of the marriage. When Immigration Services arrived at the Al-Rashid mansion the following morning, they were greeted by Mrs. Chen, who politely informed them that Miriam Goldstein was no longer employed by the household, having married Sheikh Omar the previous day. The documentation of their marriage, properly filed and witnessed, made any further investigation of Miriam's employment status irrelevant. The investigators congratulated Omar on his marriage and departed without incident, but their visit marked the beginning of a period of intense scrutiny from other quarters. News of Omar's sudden marriage to a former household employee spread quickly through Dubai's interconnected business and social communities, generating reactions that ranged from mild surprise to scandalized disapproval. Omar's mother, Fatima Al-Rashid, arrived at the mansion that afternoon in a state of barely controlled fury. She had learned about the marriage through a phone call from a family friend, and her sense of betrayal at being excluded from such a momentous decision was compounded by her concerns about the marriage's impact on the family's reputation. "Have you completely lost your mind?" she demanded, confronting Omar in his study while Miriam tactfully remained in another part of the house. "Marrying a servant without even informing your own mother? What will people think?" "They'll think that I married a woman I love," Omar replied calmly, though his mother's obvious distress troubled him more than he wanted to admit. "Love?" Fatima scoffed. "You've known her for 2 months, Omar. This isn't love, it's infatuation complicated by some misguided sense of nobility. You've always had a weakness for lost causes." "Miriam isn't a lost cause," Omar said firmly. "She's an educated, accomplished woman who was working below her qualifications due to family circumstances. If you took the time to meet her properly, you'd understand that. I understand that she's manipulated you into marriage for immigration purposes," Fatima shot back. "Do you think I'm naive, Omar? A foreign woman working as a maid suddenly becomes your wife just as immigration services begins investigating. The timing is rather convenient, don't you think?" The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to be difficult to refute completely. Omar's feelings for Miriam were genuine, but the crisis had certainly accelerated their relationship in ways that made the marriage appear calculating to outside observers. "The timing was influenced by circumstances," Omar admitted, "but the feelings weren't manufactured for convenience. I've been in love with her for weeks." "Weeks?" his mother repeated sarcastically. "How romantic." "Omar, you're 34 years old and the heir to a business empire that employs thousands of people. Your personal decisions affect more than just yourself. This impulsive marriage could damage relationships with partners throughout the region." "Then those partners have misplaced priorities," Omar replied. "Anyone who would end a business relationship because of my choice of wife isn't someone I want to work with anyway." The conversation continued for another hour, with Fatima alternating between pleading and threatening, as she tried to convince Omar to reconsider his decision. When she finally left, it was with the warning that he was destroying everything his grandfather and father had built for the sake of a woman who would inevitably disappoint him. Omar found Miriam in his grandmother's sanctuary, sitting at the desk where they had spent so many evening hours together. She was reading one of Sarah's annotated prayer books, but he could tell from her posture that she had heard at least parts of his argument with his mother. "She's not wrong about the complications," Miriam said without looking up from the book. "Your mother, I mean. This marriage will create problems for you that you haven't fully considered." "Are you having second thoughts?" Omar asked, settling into the chair across from her. "About marrying you?" "No," Miriam replied, finally meeting his eyes. "About the impact on your life and relationships?" "Constantly. Your mother's reaction is probably mild compared to what you'll face from business associates and family friends." "Let me worry about managing those relationships," Omar said. "The question is whether you're prepared for the scrutiny and criticism that will inevitably come your way." Miriam closed the prayer book and leaned back in her chair. "Omar, I grew up as a Jew in Romania, lived as an Israeli in a region where that identity creates automatic suspicion, and spent the last 6 months working as a maid despite having university degrees. I'm familiar with people questioning my choices and judging my circumstances. What I'm not familiar with is having someone defend those choices unconditionally." "Then it's time you got used to it," Omar said, reaching across the desk to take her hand. "Because I intend to defend you, our marriage, and our decisions to anyone who questions them." Their first real test came sooner than expected. The following week, Omar was scheduled to attend a business dinner hosted by the Al Maktoum Investment Group, one of Dubai's most influential development companies. The dinner was both a social occasion and an opportunity to discuss potential partnerships on several major projects. Under normal circumstances, Omar would have attended alone, but his new marriage meant that excluding Miriam would send its own message about his confidence in their relationship. "I think you should go without me," Miriam suggested when Omar mentioned the invitation. "Let people get used to the idea of our marriage gradually rather than forcing them to confront it all at once." "That would be the coward's approach," Omar replied. "If we're going to do this, we're going to do it honestly and openly. Besides, I want you there. These people need to understand that you're not some temporary embarrassment I'm trying to hide." The dinner was held at the Burj Al Arab, in a private dining room overlooking the Persian Gulf. When Omar and Miriam arrived, the reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Conversations paused as they entered, resuming in subdued tones after the couple had passed. Omar introduced Miriam simply as his wife, without elaborating on their courtship or her background, and he noted with satisfaction that most people responded with appropriate courtesy, despite their obvious curiosity. The evening's most challenging moment came when Khalid Al Maktoum, the host's son and heir apparent, approached them during the cocktail reception. "Omar, congratulations on your marriage," Khalid said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I don't believe I've had the pleasure of meeting your wife." "Miriam, this is Khalid Al Maktoum," Omar said. "Khalid, my wife Miriam." "Pleasure to meet you," Khalid said, extending his hand. "I understand you worked for Omar before your marriage. How fortunate that business led to romance." The comment was carefully worded to sound innocent, while implying something unseemly about their relationship's origins. Omar felt Miriam's slight tension beside him, but her response was perfectly composed. "Actually, our relationship developed through our shared interest in preserving cultural heritage," Miriam replied smoothly. Omar's grandmother left behind an extensive collection of historical and religious materials that required someone with relevant expertise to properly catalog and preserve. It was that work that brought us together. "How interesting," Khalid said, his tone suggesting he found it anything but interesting. "And what's your background in cultural preservation?" "I have degrees in Hebrew studies and education from the University of Bucharest," Miriam replied. "I spent several years teaching before coming to Dubai." The mention of Hebrew studies caused a brief flicker in Khalid's expression, and Omar realized that Miriam had deliberately revealed the most potentially controversial aspect of her background. It was a bold move, essentially daring Khalid to make an issue of her Jewish heritage in a public setting. "Romanian education, how diverse," Khalid said finally. "I'm sure Omar's grandmother's materials are in good hands." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Omar could see that word of Miriam's academic background and cultural expertise was spreading through the room. By the end of the evening, several other guests had approached them with what seemed like genuine interest in their preservation project, and at least two had asked for Miriam's professional opinion on artifacts in their own family collections. Driving home, Omar felt cautiously optimistic about how the evening had gone. "That was well handled," he told Miriam. "Khalid was testing us, and you passed with flying colors." "He was trying to embarrass us," Miriam agreed, "but I've learned that the best way to deal with prejudice is to be so obviously competent that people are forced to reassess their assumptions." "Is that why you mentioned Hebrew studies so prominently?" "Partly," Miriam admitted. "If people are going to object to my background, I'd rather they do it openly where we can address it directly. Hidden resentment is much more dangerous than honest disagreement." Over the following months, Omar and Miriam's strategy of openness and competence gradually won over most of their critics. As news of their cultural preservation work spread, Miriam began receiving invitations to speak at academic conferences and consult on similar projects for other prominent families. Her obvious expertise and Omar's clear devotion to their shared work made it difficult for even skeptical observers to maintain that their marriage was purely opportunistic. The transformation in Omar's business approach was equally notable. Inspired by his grandmother's writings about social responsibility and cultural bridge building, he began redirecting his investments toward projects that benefited local communities and promoted cross-cultural understanding. A new housing development included affordable units for immigrant workers. A technology startup focused on preserving endangered languages received major funding. The Al-Rashid Foundation, which had previously limited itself to conventional charitable donations, expanded its mission to include cultural education and interfaith dialogue programs. "You're becoming quite the social reformer," Marcus Anderson observed one afternoon as he briefed Omar on security arrangements for an upcoming foundation event. "Your father and grandfather would be proud." "I hope so," Omar replied, though privately he wondered whether his ancestors would have approved of all his recent decisions. The foundation's work was generating positive publicity, but it was also attracting attention from conservative elements who viewed cross-cultural initiatives with suspicion. The real test of their marriage's stability came not from external pressure, but from the challenge of learning to live together as husband and wife rather than collaborators on an intellectual project. The transition from evening conversations in his grandmother's sanctuary to sharing daily domestic life revealed differences in personality and perspective that their previous interactions hadn't exposed. Omar discovered that Miriam was remarkably disciplined about physical fitness, rising before dawn to exercise even after working late the previous evening. She was also more socially reserved than he had realized, preferring small gatherings to large parties, and showing little interest in the luxury shopping and spa treatments that many wealthy wives considered essential. Most significantly, she maintained a fierce independence about financial matters, insisting on contributing to household expenses despite Omar's protests that such contributions were unnecessary. "I need to know that I'm contributing something tangible to our life together," she explained when Omar questioned her insistence on paying for groceries and household supplies from her foundation's salary. "I spent too many years being financially dependent on others. It's important to me that this marriage feels like a partnership, not a charity arrangement." For his part, Miriam discovered that Omar's public confidence masked significant private insecurities about living up to family expectations and proving himself worthy of inherited wealth. He was also more traditional in some respects than she had expected, automatically deferring to her judgment on domestic matters while assuming she would defer to his on financial and business decisions. "I don't need you to protect me from difficult conversations about money," Miriam told him after he had tried to shield her from a heated discussion with his financial advisors about foundation funding priorities. "I may not have your business experience, but I have strong opinions about how charitable money should be spent, and I want to be involved in those decisions." These adjustments required patience and compromise from both of them, but they also deepened their understanding of each other in ways that their previous relationship hadn't allowed. Omar learned to appreciate Miriam's fierce independence as a strength, rather than viewing it as resistance to his care. Miriam learned to see Omar's protective instincts as expressions of love, rather than attempts to control her choices. 6 months after their marriage, they received news that would test their relationship in an entirely different way. Miriam's grandmother Elena had taken a turn for the worse, and the doctors in Bucharest were recommending a risky surgery that offered the only chance of extending her life. The operation would require several weeks of intensive recovery, during which Elena would need constant care and support. "I have to go to her," Miriam told Omar after ending a tearful phone call with her grandmother's doctor. "She raised me, sacrificed everything for my education and opportunities. I can't let her face this alone." "Of course you have to go," Omar agreed immediately. "How long do you think you'll need to be there?" "At least a month, possibly longer depending on how the surgery goes and how well she recovers." "Omar, I know this is terrible timing with the Foundation's upcoming symposium and the research project we're presenting, but I can't abandon her now." "The symposium will survive," Omar assured her. "Family comes first. Always." "Would you—" Miriam hesitated, clearly uncertain about making her next request. "Would you consider coming with me? I know it's a lot to ask, especially since you don't really know her, but I think she would like to meet the man who's become so important to me." Omar's immediate reaction was to agree, but practical considerations quickly intruded. He had business commitments in Dubai that would be difficult to postpone, and leaving the country for an extended period would send signals about his priorities that could affect ongoing negotiations. More significantly, traveling to Romania as Miriam's husband would mean openly acknowledging their relationship in her grandmother's social circle, a step that would make their marriage feel more real and permanent in ways that even their Dubai wedding hadn't achieved. "Yes," he said, pushing aside his concerns. "If Elena is important to you, then she's important to me. We'll figure out how to manage everything else." 2 weeks later, they arrived in Bucharest on a gray October morning that reminded Omar why people left Romania for warmer climates. Elena Goldstein lived in a small apartment in the Floreasca district, in a building that showed its communist-era origins despite recent renovations. When they climbed the narrow stairs to her third-floor apartment, Omar felt the same nervousness he had experienced before meeting his own grandmother's friends as a child. Elena herself was a tiny woman in her 80s, with silver hair arranged in an old-fashioned style and intelligent dark eyes that reminded Omar immediately of Miriam. Despite her illness, she greeted them at the door with obvious excitement, embracing Miriam tearfully before turning to study Omar with frank curiosity. "So this is the sheikh who stole my granddaughter's heart," she said in accented English, her tone suggesting she was reserving judgment about whether such theft was acceptable. "It's an honor to meet you, Mrs. Goldstein," Omar replied, offering a slight bow that seemed to amuse her. "Very polite, this one," Elena said to Miriam, in what Omar recognized as Hebrew. "But does he make you happy?" "Very happy, Grandmama," Miriam replied in the same language. "He sees me for who I really am." "Good," Elena said, switching back to English and addressing Omar directly. "That is the most important thing in marriage. My husband, may he rest in peace. He saw me as a scholar even when the world saw only a refugee. Love is easy, young man. Respect is much harder." Over the following days, as they prepared for Elena's surgery and helped her organize her affairs, Omar gained insight into the woman who had shaped Miriam's character and values. Elena had survived the Holocaust as a teenager, losing her parents and 3 siblings before making her way to Romania, with nothing but the clothes she wore and a fierce determination to rebuild her life. She had worked as a seamstress while studying languages and literature, eventually becoming a translator for the Romanian government. Her stories of survival and reinvention helped Omar understand the source of Miriam's resilience and independence. "She taught me that identity isn't something you inherit, it's something you choose every day," Miriam explained one evening as they walked through Bucharest's old Jewish quarter. When she lost her family, she could have abandoned her faith and tried to disappear into the general population. Instead, she chose to maintain her traditions while adapting to new circumstances. "That's why your grandmother's writings resonated with me so strongly. They reflected the same kind of wisdom." Elena's surgery took place on a rainy Thursday morning in November. Omar and Miriam spent the day in the hospital's waiting room, alternating between anxious conversation and silent worry. When the surgeon finally emerged to tell them that the operation had been successful, they both wept with relief. During Elena's recovery, something shifted in Omar and Miriam's relationship. Caring for her together, navigating the Romanian healthcare system, and sharing the intimacy of family crisis created a bond between them that their previous challenges hadn't produced. They began to function as a true partnership, making decisions collaboratively and supporting each other through the emotional stress of uncertain outcomes. "You know," Elena said to Omar one afternoon as he helped her with physical therapy exercises, "when Miriam first told me about you, I was worried that she was making the same mistake I made with her grandfather." "What mistake was that?" Omar asked. "Marrying someone for practical reasons instead of emotional ones," Elena replied. "I married my first husband because he could provide security after the war, not because I loved him. It was not a happy marriage. When he died and I met Miriam's grandfather, I promised myself I would never again marry for anything other than love." "But you approve of our marriage?" Elena smiled. "I see how you look at each other when you think the other isn't watching. I see how you move around each other in this small apartment, never getting in each other's way, always anticipating what the other needs. That is not duty or gratitude. That is love that has grown strong roots." By the time Elena was well enough for them to return to Dubai, Omar realized that their month in Romania had accomplished something that their previous 6 months of marriage hadn't quite achieved. They had become a family, bound together not just by legal documents or shared projects, but by the deeper ties that come from facing life's uncertainties together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.